1, 2, 1, 2. One, two.
Hello and welcome to Science Gallery Dublin for a new age of activism. Just like you know that there are two fire exits to the door to the left of the stage and the door to the right of the stage at the back of the room. In case of an emergency, please follow the instructions of staff and exit the building safely. I'm delighted to announce our four speakers and chair this evening. We have Joe Caslin, Sinéad O'Sullivan, Subset, Lian Bell, and Michael McDermott, who's kindly agreed to chair. So put your hands together for our panel.
Hi, cheers. Thanks very much. Hi, is that okay? Yeah. Okay, let's kick it off then. So just in order again, Lian, Sinéad, Subset, and Joe. So I guess a quick, very brief introduction to each person, and then we'll start the ball rolling. So I guess Lian's been involved in many campaigns, but I guess best known in recent times for Waking the Feminists, which happened in the autumn of 2015 and had a pretty seismic effect on not just equality within the theatre community in terms of its representation through directors and writers and playwrights and casting, but also I think in the wider cultural world of the city, or cultural sphere of the city. Sinéad O'Sullivan's Trinity graduate also, and has set up the costume directory, which looks at ethical sourcing, waste minimization, and basically a directory for improving the fashion industry, I guess, in essence.
The costume.
And the costume particularly industry. Subset is part of a artist collective in the city who's made some incredible murals and impactful thoughts and views displayed publicly, and we'll be chatting to Subset in a while as well about their collective and what they're up to. And then Joe Caslin is, I guess, an artist, an educator, has been responsible for some of the most amazing murals as well, and installations, both in Trinity College and in the city and around the country in recent times. In particular, I guess, two associated with both the marriage equality and repeal the 8th referendum in recent times. So I just wanted to start off by asking you all the question as to whether you feel you were a born activist from the outset, or whether it was in your DNA, or what was the first thing you got head up about, or is it something that you accidentally happened upon?
With me?
Yeah.
Okay. I think very much, if anybody knows the background of Waking the Feminists, it was very much accidental, the whole thing. It was kicked off by me putting a post up on Facebook and then getting absolutely knocked over by a tsunami of response. So, no. But at the same time, I suppose I've always had I felt like I've always had a very strong social conscience. I always wanted to be able to do something, and I was never quite sure where I could put my energies. It just sometimes feels like there's so many things you can be an activist about in the world. So what happened was, I suppose, feminism chose me,
Right.
and I just went for it.
Sinead?
Yeah, I guess it's similar in the sense that I'm a costume designer, and I very rarely refer to myself as an activist, because I've always just looked at ways that I could try and do my job and not have a negative impact on the environment and not impact people. And I've always had an interest in sustainable fashion and a good strong case of Catholic guilt. And I think all of those things combined meant that I was just doing my job and realizing that it was impossible to do that without having a huge impact and on the environment. And I kind of started to think, well, why is it like this? And I started to question it a lot more. And everyone in the industry was just lamenting our industry, but not doing anything about it. So I just started the Costume Directory, which is an open source. And then also it became a platform for other costume designers to come together so that we could collectively try and change the infrastructure, both behind the scenes, but on screen, and kind of see how we could use our platform to try and promote and educate people really on clothing and the way clothing is made. And look at different ways of doing things. So yeah, I very rarely refer to myself as an activist, because I think, I'm not super gluing myself to a railing, but at the same point, other people have started referring to me in that way, so it's kind of a bit of a surprise.
Okay. Subset?
I'd say I was born rebellious, and over time I channeled that into certain activities. But I believe in action rather than activism. I think there's a distinction between one and the other.
How would you make that distinction?
By acting on things that you actually believe in. Like, it's one thing to wear a badge and say that you believe in something. It's another thing to stand up for that issue, to risk something.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a little bit. That idea. And Joe?
I don't really know how I came to the point of being an activist, or kind of being active. Lots of things fucked me off. I saw a lot of things that were wrong, that when you look at it through the eyes of empathy, and you use your voice correctly, that you can make, kind of a conversation that is needed. You had said, or you'd asked earlier on, how does that fit, how did that generate? And I think it came from my grandfather. He was a fireman, and he would have come across lots of miscarriages through his, kind of work as a firefighter or someone that is in the emergency services. And quite often he would have got up in the middle of the night and brought that body to the graveyard and dug a grave into, kind of where the family plot was. And that would have been kind of an activism against, kind of the trends of the day. So I think it was just ingrained really from family circumstance, that if you see something that is wrong and you have an opportunity to create a conversation or write it in some way, well, then it's your responsibility to do that.
Mm. And then just maybe to go back to each of you again and go a little bit more into the kind of the projects and how you've distilled, I guess, the idea of activism. Lian, I suppose, so you referenced it being a Facebook post, and then suddenly, so subconsciously, you were looking through the kind of basically the program for the Abbey, and was it a kind of, were you kind of going like, this doesn't add up, this doesn't make sense? Because in some regards, I guess, Waking the Feminist movement and the idea that I think it was maybe 18 plays, or there was a crazy imbalance, that there was maybe one or two female directors or writers out of the whole cast that had been announced for the Abbey. And so even though that was only 3 years ago, it feels crazy that it was that recent, and that you had to call it out that recently. But I guess, was it you were just kind of going, this doesn't add up, this is kind of weird,
Yeah, I think
and then the reaction rolled in.
I think at the time, I probably would have called myself a feminist, but I don't know if I would even have really been able to tell you what that meant. And I suppose over the previous months leading up to that Facebook post, a couple of people had said things or pointed out imbalances in the world around me that just kind of got me thinking. So when the Abbey announced its programme for 2016, I did just do a quick tot of of the names of who was included. And at the time I was really, really worn out. Like in my work I was absolutely exhausted, and I had reached the point of just going, actually, if I say something and it blows up in my face, because it felt like it could, it felt that if you said something publicly you might get blacklisted or something awful like this. Like, I'm a set designer, I don't work for the Abbey, and I don't really want to work for the Abbey, to be honest. So it didn't feel that dangerous for me, but I was so tired that I was like, well, if it does blow up in my face and everybody turns around and goes, you fucking idiot, I'm going to go and work in a bar in the south of France, and I don't give a shit. So like, I can write it. So like, that was, you know, and like, it's funny now in retrospect, but I've talked to a few different people who've become activists or who have kind of put themselves in the spotlight in that way. And the common thing for a lot of us is feeling that you've kind of reached the end of your tether, which is a really sad idea, that you have to kind of get to the point of feeling like, fuck it, I don't care. And that's when you can actually do it. Yeah, and it is funny to think that it's only a few years ago, because certainly in the theatre industry in Ireland, in the theatre community, it's now almost impossible to programme without having some kind of clear gender balance, because people will call you out straight away. And not just in theatre. If you look at, you know, the literature festival or arts festivals, people will count the numbers now and call the festivals out, which is amazing, because at the time of Waking the Feminist, it felt dangerous. Like, it felt that by saying this you could be seen as one of the crazy ladies who always complains.
And so is it fair to say that if you were doing this, we'll say 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, it would have been called a letter to the Irish Times, and you probably may or may not have felt, you know, that you were in a position of authority, so to speak, to be able to write that letter or to be published. And so using the medium, and I guess getting to the idea of the new age of activism, using the medium of Facebook and social media created that ripple effect immediately, which kind of almost by the time you'd put the stamp on the letter and got it in, you know, like within hours, you knew that there was something going on, that you had touched a nerve, and that this was going to carry.
And this is you know, I wasn't a massive fan of social media, and I still have great reservations about it, but the amazing thing that it does is just give you a platform to find your peers like that. Like, it's amazing. Your peers can be anywhere in the world, and all of a sudden you have access to them. So for Waking the Feminists, one of the things we did early on was tap into the Irish diaspora of theatre people who'd gone to work, particularly in places like New York and Melbourne and London and so on, and get them to get famous people that they knew to hold up signs saying, I support Waking the Feminists. So like, the one that did it for us, that really like exploded the media, I suppose, for us, was Meryl Streep, holding up literally a paper napkin saying, I support Waking the Feminists. And it's something that simple that suddenly gets you noticed. Whereas, 15 years ago I wouldn't have written to the Irish Times, because I wouldn't have cared, to be honest. But also, it wouldn't have landed at all.
Had that same impactful or that same kind of immediacy. No. And then Sinead, at what point did you, what was the genesis of the costume directory? Like, at what point did you go, this is something I want to get behind, create? Like, was it through your professional career? Was it through observations?
It was through my professional career, but it was in 2013. There was the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh, which killed over 1,000 garment workers. And I was just horrified at the time, as someone who makes clothes for a living, that there were women in the developing world who were making clothes for our consumption that were just in a situation where a building can collapse around them and very few people will care. And that really just horrified me, and that spurred me to kind of think, well, actually, the sustainable fashion movement and the ethical fashion movement was gaining momentum, but as costume designers, I predominantly work in film, and on an average job we can make anywhere between 300 to 3,000 costumes. So we might do two jobs each job, or 2 a year. And so our capacity to have an impact is much more significant than the average consumer. So I started to think, well, okay, it's all very well me saying, okay, I'm going to buy from sustainable designers, and I'm going to only dress ethically or buy vintage or this, that, and the other. And then I go to work and I'm sourcing a significant amount of fabric and textiles which are being produced in developing countries with poor labour laws, where people are pouring dyes into rivers, and the health consequences of it are really significant, and that's all to feed our consumption. And I just started to think whether or not it could be done in a different way. So I was on a film at the time, and we decided that we would only source our textiles from ethical and sustainable sources. And then we started to look more at, okay, if we were buying clothes for actors to wear, even if they're just wearing them around the set and the Daily Mail comes and photographs them, what are we promoting? So using our platform in that way, and then from there it's just sort of grown. And with costume designers, it's probably the same with set. You have your contacts and you just kind of keep them very close to your chest. Like if you find a really good embroiderer, you find this, that, and the other, you're like, okay, they're mine. And I decided that actually to try and get sustained business for artisans and for designers and for people who are doing the right thing, that I just share my contacts and then hope that other designers would do the same thing. And yeah, that's where the costume directory came. So I just did it in my spare time. It was kind of, you know, in the evenings on Microsoft Word trying to format something. And then it's just grown from there. And then BAFTA came on board and they published it. And they've hosted events. So it's become a platform for designers to get together. And it's kind of become that thing that people get in touch with me and they're like, but what about plastic? And I'm like, okay, let's look at plastic now. And then they're like, well, what about this and what about that? And so again, I've been just trying to get more people involved, and I'm a big believer in this sort of everyday activist thing that like no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. So rather than us just going, okay, we can do, you know, well, we're not, this isn't covered, and look at all those actors flying in private jets, and you're talking about the environment, like what's one plastic bottle going to do? But it's just more that a collective effort and creating a wider, just, I suppose, waking people up to the wider consciousness of it, drawing attention to the fact that there are people in the developing world who are making our clothes, trying to get a bit more people's interest in the integrity of actually making clothes. Like if I was to make something, if I was to make a dress, it'd take me ages. Like I design now because I'm like, geez, that takes too long. But we work with people who are amazing craftspeople, and we largely produce now in the UK. But also we do work in factories in India, so we try and find out, well, what are those people getting paid? What's the hourly rate? What is not just the average wage, but what's the living wage for people in those countries? What's the living wage for people in this country? Because in the UK, anyway, there's still factories that produce, but actually slave labour exists in the UK as well. So just starting to ask a bit more questions and just starting to look at the integrity of what we're producing. And we're not able to do it perfectly. Sometimes you have to go to the high street, sometimes you have to do this. And I'm a big believer in that. You don't just kind of go, okay, well, it's all out the window now because we have to go to Topshop. It's kind of a belief that actually we can try and do better, and collectively, if people come together, they can try and do better.
And have you tried to obviously tilt the industry towards kind of again signing up for a code of conduct, or to kind of going, you know what, we know we're not going to get this 100% right, but we are going to make an effort, and we are going to make sure that this production that we're involved in will adhere to at least some of the principles as best possible. So
that's what, with BAFTA has a sustainability scheme that they try and get productions to sign up for. But the biggest issue is that the film industry in particular is a sort of Wild West, ruleless, and you know, it's the same as theatre, it's all this kind of thing, you're only as good as your last job, and everyone is freelance. So you might get to the end of a job and you're like, right, we really cracked it on this one. And then you move on to the next job and it's like, you know, you're just starting from scratch again. And again, no one is paying me, like this is not my job to go in and be in charge of sustainability. Sometimes they have people in charge, but they feel like they very rarely think about the whole holistic picture of, okay, it's like, okay, well, if we just get everyone in you know, using keep cups, it's like, okay, that's done. And that's a tick. But they don't want actually people to investigate the overall thing. So what we're trying to do at the moment is try and get people to sign up to like 10 principles and a memorandum that they'll say. We're trying to push things like Meat Free Monday. You know, there's agendas where you can really reduce your carbon impact significantly. And we're appealing to different producers to take that on board because, again, each company exists in the film industry for about 6 months, so to a year, and then that company's gone and everyone disbands and they go on to separate projects. So it's just getting projects to also think not just about the design, but what happens at the end. So if you're left with all of this, these fabrics, weights, just general sets, things like that, it's what's going to happen. Can they be repurposed? And what will happen to them, not just in a year's time, but are you designing things that will still exist in 300 years' time? Like, are you designing stuff that won't degrade? Are you using the proper principles and resources and things like that?
So again, it's something like that kind of syndrome of the festival tent, which is, you know, the nightmare
Yeah.
when everybody walks away and abandons it.
Exactly.
But it's kind of like the usefulness of all of these sets, and obviously within the film industry would be so beneficial, whether that's
Yeah.
to local communities or productions
Schools,
or
and it's just
there's
getting
so
a bit
much.
more thought. Like,
Yeah.
the people kind of lament and go, oh, look at this waste, and it's like, well, okay, but you know, there's a school down the road, let's get it to there. And so that's with the costume director. We've got a whole catalogue of things at the end, just fabric scraps, fabric schools. So we advertise the schools that are nearby the different studios so that they can get in touch, and you've got a link to a teacher where you can say, okay, this person. And then if they're oversubscribed, there's also the charity shop thing that we try and get more and more people to source secondhand. So a lot of the time the reason people are going to the high street is because it's difficult to source secondhand. So now we're trying to make it easier for people so that they can buy things and return things within charity shops, and getting people to try and commit to that. It's a real.
And Subset, just what is the kind of starting point for you guys as a collective when you decide upon an idea or you decide upon a space? I assume, does the space come before the idea? I'm just wondering how you operate. I guess in terms of like what you're deciding to put out there and how you're representing yourselves.
Well, some things would be like long term, like issues that we feel are close community-wise and close to our hearts, like homelessness or injustices against like homophobia, stuff like that. Like, so they would be like continuous, ongoing things that we would try to push the message on. And then you have things that are current and social, like Julian Assange, for instance. Like, so you would like collectively we will come together and discuss something, and some people have more militant ideas than other people, some people have less militant ideas, and we've got to come to a nice solution for everyone, a compromise sometimes, you know. But it's the idea, then we would fit the idea to the space mostly, you know.
Right.
So if some ideas just need a small amount of text to get the message across, and then some would need like more visual things, so you would up the scale of the space then, you know.
And then I guess one of the challenges, or I guess for you guys in the city, has been space itself, finding space, and the kind of the parameters that are set between what's authorised that you can work on, what isn't. And I guess like something like the Stormzy mural that was well documented last year in Smithfield, or temporary spaces like the Grey Area project down in the Point Village last autumn. But do you find that is it important that there is I guess a push and pull with you in authority? Is there I guess is that the nature of what you do, or would it be a lot more, even though it might be easier, would it be problematic, we'll say, if Dublin City Council said we're going to give you X amount of designated zones where you can be happily like have playgrounds for your murals? Does there have to be a tension there? Is that important?
No, I don't believe that. Like, it would be better if they just eased off, because at the moment we come from the standpoint that what they say doesn't really matter, because we believe that it's unlawful. Their legality is unlawful. So like, just because they have it as a bylaw doesn't mean it's actually legal. So we're just going to continue doing what we're doing, and hopefully they just cop on and leave us alone,
Yeah. And Joe, I guess it's somewhat similar for you in certain circumstances where you
we're nearly in the same bed at this stage.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you finding that kind of squeeze as well, or are you just there's an element of like I've just got to go ahead and do it?
Yeah, I've always found that. Like on the day that I was about to put up the marriage equality piece that was on Georgia Street, Dublin City Council rang me and told me that evening at 5 to 6 that if I put that up, they'd bring me to the High Court. So I said, well, obviously I said, fuck that, and I put it up. So it was like, like, the city is not a sacred space. We're professionals. Like, everybody, the vast majority of my peers that are street artists, and we're practicing artists. We have gone to, kind of college. We're professional people. We know what we want to say. We have an audience that is across every demographic. People want and deserve to be kind of provoked by the visual language and that the stuff that we install. We can't, like, things are often now. For example, there was that horrific case that was down in Cork where that solicitor, kind of commented on the underwear that a young girl wore and said that she was asking for it because of the lace black underwear that she used. And if I wanted to make something in conversation about that, if I followed the doctrine that was in place, or kind of supposedly put in place by DCC, a response piece wouldn't be made in reflection or upon that for about 6 months. So kind of, we need to speak off our time. You wouldn't do that to a journalist. Like a journalist will be allowed to give across their point, and it has a space. There's a space that's generated through the printed press, or there's a space that's generated through, kind of the online world. So why are we being restricted in kind of in respect to that? It's tough, but then it's great crack hopping through planning law, because you can find lots of bits of gaps, and you become more learned, every time that you engage in it. And lots of the people that, the ones that are in holding control and holding power, they've never stood inside in an art college in their lives. So how do they curate what we go about speaking, creating? So that dynamic is there. And we're not asking for anything new. Like, you look at many European cities, we don't even have an arts policy in this country. Over in Melbourne, they have a street art policy. They're down to that finality of documentation. We're still kicking that can of an arts policy way down the road.
And do you think that is because maybe they're perceived as new mediums because the country has this kind of maybe smugness about itself and sees itself as particularly artistic and very cultured, and because we've always punched above our weight in terms of whether that's literature or music or art acclaim internationally, that there's this kind of sense that, well, we don't really need that. We are kind of a pretty artistic, cultural
painting on walls is
space.
Thousands of years old. People have been painting on walls since forever. It's part of our history and culture. It's how we portray ourselves. Since we've been in caves, we've been putting paintings on walls.
Also, I think Ireland has a really schizophrenic attitude to the arts. In the sense
Great
that,
way of putting it.
like, we are, we're very proud of our artists, and our politicians are very proud of our artists, and we get flown. Not me personally, but artists get flown around the world. But Ireland does live on its reputation of being an incredibly cultural country, and it is, like you said, it punches so far above its weight for the size, and also for the amount of investment. Like, the Arts Council has such a tiny amount of money. I think we're still one of the lowest, like per capita, we have the lowest amount of arts funding in Europe. Not the lowest, but one of the lowest.
Second lowest.
Was it second lowest?
Yes.
So it's like we're being fed crumbs and finding it really difficult to survive. And we were just talking outside about like the issue of, let's not go into it, but housing and space and all that sort of stuff. But literally physical space for artists to have studios. In Dublin, there are practically hardly any left, and the ones that are just too expensive. So we're being squeezed out financially, and we're not being supported. While at the other end of the spectrum, we're being told Ireland, lives on its cultural glory, and that just drives me crazy because it's just this huge disconnect. And I'm watching so many people who are friends of mine who are working in the arts who are starting to leave the country. Like, certainly leaving Dublin, but also leaving Ireland. And I just feel like we're at a really, it feels like a crossroads in Ireland for many different reasons, but I feel like Dublin in particular is in danger of losing its cultural heart. So I really appreciate, artists who make their work visible apart from anything, like the fact that you guys are actually making work that's just, like you said, it's democratic, it's for anybody who's passing by. Somebody recently said a quote which I just thought was amazing, which was, our audience should look like taxpayers. Like, the people who see our work should just look like regular taxpayers, and that's exactly what you guys are able to do.
Yeah. And so does that vacuum then between the lack of maybe state recognition of cultural output or cultural activism? There is in this element of brands stepping into that vacuum, obviously, because they are, there is a kind of activism appropriation by a lot of brands out there. And quite recently, I was just looking for the current issue of the magazine. This amazing Northern Irish director called Aoife McArdle, who's just created, she did her debut feature film last year, Kissing Candace, but has done a lot of wonderful advertising. And the most recent one is for Nike, which I think is Dream With Us, which is a follow-up to the Serena Williams one earlier this year. And that's a prime example of a brand who's down with activism, who's down with getting on board. How do you feel about that? Because I guess there's inherent dangers in that, but at the same time, there's also a means to making a living. Maybe Subset first and foremost, because you guys, you have to make a living. You're not getting necessarily supported, so sometimes you have to accept some money from brands ultimately, right?
Yeah, sometimes you have to get into bed with the devil, for sure. And then you just have to try and put checks and balances in place. So like we would try and get them to sponsor our pieces rather than have brand heavy advertising. There's other people that do that, and that wouldn't be for us. And also, some companies are slightly more ethical than other companies, and you've got to you've got to eat, and you've got to fund your other campaigns somehow. We live in a world that's run by money and run by economy, so therefore you've got to fight from the inside out, really. There's no way you're getting from the outside in. So sometimes you've got to use your enemy's resources against them.
And do you think that's a shame that not as, well, I guess in some regards that you're reduced to that you're reduced to maybe having to have big commercial brands as a bedfellow in order for you to not just realise your ideas but also just to simply exist?
I don't really see the difference between that and some rich elitist patron who decides he wants to direct the future of our art. It's like, oh yes, I really like this one, and then you produce another artwork and it's like, oh well, I really like the first one, could you reproduce that one? So either way, once you're touching money and using money, it's filthy anyway, so there's never going to be anything really positive from it. So you've just got to be stoic about it and say, okay, this is a fact, I've got to use this fact to the best of my ability, so I need this money because I've got X, Y, and Z in the future that I would like to produce, I would like to support, so I'll take that money where a homeless group can't take it or someone else can't take it because I've got access to it. Yeah. And then I'm going to, it's like having the ring in the Lord of the Rings, There's only so much good you can do with that ring,
Joe, have you encountered that? Obviously, as your reputation and stature has grown, I'm sure there's somebody sitting in an agency going, oh, look what he did there with that marriage equality. We've got to get him on board.
3 agencies in that device at the minute. It comes, there's not a week that goes by that you're not, seen as, someone that will be able to bring on that story. Sometimes you have to bite the bullet. I have a kind of a rule that I will fund 90% of what I produce. And as an artist, that doesn't happen in any other profession, but it is, it's something that we have to, dance with. And sometimes you do need to accept that money, but you do install checks and balances. I worked with a drinks brand a couple of years back, and I made it my business that I wasn't going to engage with that project unless there was an established relationship with the organisation that they wanted to support. And that has resulted in nearly €40,000 that has gone into that, so 10 grand every year. And that's actually much better than the drawing that was installed because it's created a lasting relationship. So things like that are important. But I also feel that we fail as a country when we allow, big money to come in and, to maybe dictate what we produce, or that's where the funding comes from. The government are able to find, funding when they need to for certain cohorts. And it's a shame that, as you had said earlier, that, the percentage of our GDP is so minute when it comes to funding any kind of cultural capital.
And I saw it was something today, it's just to kind of element of political cynicism about like a £10 million sports fund that's just been conveniently released on the week of European elections. So again, in that kind of argument of there is money there, it can be found when necessary. And
But I kind of have to check myself as well. We can't always blame the person that isn't in the room, or blame government. We also have a responsibility, and there's a great thing that our audience are great supporters of what we create. So when you do put up a piece, people are willing to spend, kind of on prints, and they're willing to go to shows, and they're, willing to engage with, kind of with stuff that's put out there. So that's important that, that people understand how to play their role and how to play their part, kind of in the story.
And then I just subset. I know you guys just started a Patreon scheme to kind of get people to support your initiatives, and I think it was something like you said you needed. Is it 2,000? If you get 2,000 people to kind of sign up and support you for a $5 a month, that'll enable you to, I guess, primarily give you independence,
free
right?
us from having to bend over for corporations, really, and allow us to just produce art for art's sake, and to stand behind things that we believe in, So like funding like that, like I'm not really into social media. I would be like against social media for everything it stands for. But every now and again it seems to do something positive.
Yeah.
But then you've got a lot of bandwagoners, so maybe the bandwagoners, you need the bandwagoners to jump on your cause every now and again,
Yeah. I guess, Sinead, in terms of your conversations then as well, have you conversations with big fashion houses? Have you been brought into that kind of realm where obviously that kind of tear between ultimately fast fashion, which is a very profitable but ethically dubious world, and what you're striving to inculcate, I guess, in terms of their kind of ideas and manifestos?
Yeah, I guess for me, I tend to just talk more to like big film studios and things like that. So like I work with Disney and Warner Brothers, and they can be, dubious in terms of their policies on different things. But at the same point, I often feel they give me a budget, and then I have a choice where I spend that. So I get to spend their money in certain areas where it wouldn't otherwise be spent, and I get to produce. There's sort of a thing that, there's an integrity in some ways to producing art that is inherently ethical, rather than art that shouts or says what it is, and it's just a different kind. And for me, with the costume directory, it was more about the inherent structure of what we're producing, and so using their money, I get to do that in a way. But also, as I said before, I'm a costume designer, so I go to jobs where I like the idea of the costumes. And then with the fast fashion thing, I do write a lot to fast fashion brands. There is a lot of greenwashing that makes me really sad, but also, and people talking about sustainability as a trend, and it's like, well, it's not a trend. It's not like, we're just going to move on from it in a couple of years and start doing something else. And yeah, so I get really angry about fast fashion, but I also realize that for most people, the sustainable fashion movement, just getting people to reduce what they consume and that whole thing, it is a trend. It is Instagrammable at the moment. That is a thing that people may tire of. So you need to be in the room with those big companies who are producing and get them to realize that, okay, people want to buy things that are made better. There is an awareness. The more you can spread awareness, the more you can write to them. There was a statistic that Karen Millen got 10 letters complaining about a jacket that had rabbit fur, and they completely took the line off the ring, because 10 letters was enough for them to go, this could go viral, and we don't want the bad press. So that in itself, so we always say, if we have to buy something from the high street, or if we have to go there, then we write to them, and that in itself, lobbying, can make a huge amount of difference. And it's the same thing with producers in film. If they get a sense that actually they can get a good news story out of something, they're like, yeah, great, sign us up,
Is there, though, an irony, we'll say, in terms of, in one regards, how something like social media has been beneficial to activism? But then when I think about something like, we'll say, the idea of the selfie and the younger generation, coming through, particularly on Instagram and whatever else, and that, like, the idea of being on trend, being on point, having the latest reference, it's kind of that cycle of, will say I saw recently the Alexander McQueen documentary, and at the, you know, when he was literally at the end of his tether, he was producing 15 collections a year. Now, he brought some of that on himself by expanding his business and empire, but that speed to react, and now it's, you know, where once upon a time it might have come through a monthly fashion glossy or maybe even a TV fashion show, you know, which used to exist. Now it's like...
Yeah, it's a disaster in a lot of ways, because this whole idea that as soon as a celebrity wears something, that needs to be on the shelves. So at the moment, Topshop produce about 7,000 to 8,000 styles a year. So rather than where fashion houses used to have 2 collections a year, they have like not just 7,000 pieces, they have 7,000 different items that then goes on the floor. So that's just rotating constantly. There's just new things. And that's the business model, essentially, is that you want everyone who walks through Primark to find something new every time they go in there, so they'll keep going back. They won't just go in once a month. So that's the idea. It's just rolling, rolling, rolling. It's all largely made of polyester, so it falls apart quite quickly. It then goes in the bin. Even if it goes to a charity shop, it's just continuing the cycle of something that will never disintegrate, and people just want new things. The idea that you can't wear the same thing to a wedding you wore like a couple of months beforehand, because heaven forbid you might be seen in the same outfit twice. So there's on one hand, there's more people becoming awake to the idea of sustainable fashion and the idea of fast fashion and the consequences of fast fashion. But on the other hand, you've got online misguided ASOS, where before you had to go out shopping, now you can just order something very quickly, have it delivered the next day, wear it that Saturday, and have it in the bin the following week or in a charity. So that's the chasm, and it's very sad.
And then I guess one of the things was the kind of the idea of open source, which is really important, and that was particularly with regards to the directory, is that the idea of just getting it out there, letting everybody tap into it and inform themselves. How important is the concept of open source to activism now?
I think one of the things that we tapped into completely by, everything to do with Waking the Feminists was completely by accident, so forgive me if I keep saying it's completely by accident, but one of the things we tapped into completely by, Waking the Feminists. One of the things we tapped into completely by accident was what we called, I think we did call them like open source events or something like this, but basically we held a huge event in the Abbey Theatre at the end of 2015, which was absolutely enormous. The tickets for it disappeared in 7 minutes when we put them up on for free online, but then we had something like 1,500 people watching it on live stream, as well as people in the foyer. You know, it was just massive. And then loads of people were saying, you know, we want to meet, we want to get together. And I realized that we as a tiny voluntary group couldn't organize events everywhere that people wanted to have them, and we were mostly based in Dublin, which felt very unfair to only have events in Dublin. So we literally said, okay, well, how about on Nullag Naman on the 6th of January, how about you put on a Waking the Feminist event, whoever you are, wherever you are, just call it a Waking the Feminist event. And say, like, it's for you guys to get together, to have a chat. You might want to go for a walk. I don't know, I don't care. Just go and do it. And it was an amazing moment for me of understanding that so many people just need a tiny bit of permission. So people were getting in touch with me going, you know, I'm in New York, I want to put something on. Can I call it a Waking the Feminist event? And I just go, yeah. And then they go off and do all the work. So on that 6th of January, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was something like 15 different events around the world, from like New York. There was one in Melbourne, I think. There was definitely a couple in London. And there was one on Inisheer that was somebody's mother saying, I'm just going to open my house, and anyone who wants to drop in and have a cup of tea and talk about feminism, you know, you're welcome. And like those kind of things just made me go, like, that's exactly what it's about. You know, it's the sense of people taking responsibility themselves. But I think it made me realize that people need a little bit of, it felt like permission. Like, it felt like asking somebody, can I do this? And all I had to do was say yes, and then they would run for it, which was amazing.
So the important thing is the empowering of people and
Oh,
feeling that there
completely.
isn't the ownership of an idea
Completely.
or
That
the
was
ownership
really
of
important.
being right on about something, or particularly pushing the agenda. It's like, let it out there
Yeah.
and interpret that as well.
Exactly, and like, you know, I resisted for so long. I became like the campaign director of Waking the Feminists, which I titled myself because it had to look judgy. But it was such a huge collective of people, and it was so amorphous, and it was people stepping in when they could and when they had time and when they felt that they had the energy and the expertise. And it was so big and it was so amorphous that Waking the Feminists it looked from the outside like an organisation, and inside it was just like this endless shifting mass of people. Yeah, I don't really know where I was going with that point, but yeah.
Is the old school thinking?
remembering.
Is the old school thinking about that? That basically you will say you've got somebody, let's just say Inashir, for example, who decides, you know what, I'm part of Waking the Feminists, and you've empowered them to represent you, to hashtag you, to wear the T-shirt, and suddenly they act unruly, or they get into a huff and they create a bit of drama, whether that's down the pub or with somebody else, and suddenly we're on to Joe Duffy and off we go, and it's kind of not in my name sort of scenario.
We talked a little bit, I mean, we talked a lot about that.
So you've got guiding principles or rules or a little bit of an outline?
No, we didn't.
Kind of?
We didn't really. And also, somebody made the point really early on that it's really handy when you're an activist. How do I describe this? So I'm a very mild-mannered person, and I'm very, I can be very articulate, and I can sit down in meetings with people and look very serious. And then there were people in Waking the Feminists who were wanting to write the big ranty online, like, rah! And I was like, great, because what that does is it makes the people I'm dealing with go, well, at least she's not like that. We can talk to her. And so all of a sudden they're dealing, and that sounds really cynical, but it's like, we come to them with a proposition that they previously would have said no to, and then they see the big, scary, like, crazy person online, and then they see there's me that they can talk to, and they go, okay, we can talk to her. So already you're in the door. So actually that, I think the whole gamut of activism is important. Like, you need the completely out there, rule-breaking, you need the rule breakers to then push it so far that people who are a bit more
that's kind of like smart thinking. So it's kind of going, you know what, this person's so, obviously everybody's equal passion, but everybody's got different personalities
and
in terms
everyone's
of how
got a
they
different
deliver
role
that.
in just pushing it.
Yeah.
And like all you have to do is just keep pushing it.
Yeah. Joe, you're in Tullamore in the school as well, you teach down there, and there's the wonderful story of the student last year that you showed, or that was obviously in RTE. Do you want to, I guess, the younger generation that's coming through, and at one level, I can diss them as I did earlier about Instagram,
It
but
was
then
actually this time last year. I have the absolute pleasure of teaching two boys, a family that came over from Nigeria 11 years ago, the Mujekes. And Chidi came over, she lost her husband, and she came to Ireland on Valentine's Day and applied for asylum when she came to Ireland. And she lived on the periphery of, kind of life for 11 years, always dodging, always looking behind her back to see, who was coming. And always did the very best, kind of worked, paid her taxes, never got any child's allowance, never got, kind of any, state aid whatsoever, and eked out a life. And that's not unusual, because the Irish have been doing that, for centuries. And we absolutely did it when, kind of the migration was to America. And we have TDs who go over and actively ask for the documentation of undocumented Irish. So she lived here for 11 years, and there was a deportation order that was issued. And then the deportation order came to all the kids and Chidi, and that had devastating effects. And we as a school came together, and we decided, I wanted to make a drawing on it, and that was my, kind of how I thought I was my role in the story. So the school came together, and the kids couldn't understand how Nonso was being taken away from his life here. He came when he was 3. His whole life and world was in Tullamore. So the school got together, the kids went out with a big placard and went to every business in town and pulled the people outside the door with the placard and made them take a photograph of it and put it on their Facebook page. And within the space of about maybe 2 weeks, they had 22,000 votes. On a petition that was online. And that's when I started to kick in and over the course of the last couple of years, I've met some, kind of fairly influential people. We decided we were going to have we can't call it a protest anymore, a demonstration at the gates of Leinster House. And every leader of the opposition came and stood with us. And that kind of never happened before in that story. RTE came down to the school, spoke to the kids, because it was the kids that led it. And every one of the kids, one of the 650 stood at the front door of the school, and that photograph is now gone into a CSPE book because it was so radical, which is amazing. But it was kids that were coming up to us going, I saw Charlie Flanagan, I told him that he needed to change his mind. And me uncle met him in the shop buying bread, and it was kind of, so, and it was, every time a politician stood outside the door in Tullamore for about a month, they were being, asked, and why would you do that to a child? And it was, the thinking, there was no empathy in it whatsoever. So bit by bit, they told us that, we're going to open the floodgates. Now there's 6,000 people in Ireland that are in direct provision. In the height of the recession, 147,000 people left Ireland to go and seek a life outside here. Now we're on about 6,000. Jesus, the floodgates. I can't understand that. It's ridiculous. So open the floodgates, let all 6,000 of them stay, and start fresh, go again. So it was brilliant. One random Tuesday, Chidi rang me up, and she goes, "I got the letter." No, she says, "Will you come to me work?" And I was like, "Oh shit, there's something wrong." We were at a point at which we had safe houses for the kids because we knew that they couldn't separate the mum and Nanso. So we had safe houses. We had, kind of a lot of safe houses in Tullamore, so that if something came, and they lived separated for, kind of a period of time that was in the run up to that. So she rang and she said, and I remember the tears flowing down her face, and I can stay. And a year on, you should see her, the energy flows out of her. She has a job, the boys are happy, they're in a new house. The house, there's light, there's joy. And they've given to me so much more than I could have ever given to them. And they keep going, "Oh, thank you." And I'm looking at them, well, it's me that has profited by you being here. And it was great. And within 24 hours of that case being, when they allowed them to stay, there was a young boy that was in Wicklow, a 7-year-old young boy. 3 days after that, there was a young man that was in UCD. Another week after that, there was a young girl that was down in Kerry. And there is a nonso in every school that's in this country. And now people have hope that they can, kind of pluck away at it, and they can right the absolute wrong that's taken place.
And so is one of the big kind of, I guess one of the lessons to kind of extrapolate from that is sometimes is individualizing the idea or the campaign, and that was particularly effective, I think, in the marriage equality one a number of years ago. But also, this is a kind of putting a face to the 6,000 people, and that's really significant, isn't it? Because they're not just just.
And it's simple, in the marriage equality referendum, we were thrown at lots of different stories. It was about kids, and it was so more complicated, and it wasn't that at all. It was about love. It was about absolute love, and that it was seen as equal, and that was the core message. And the same thing is what was being asked is, the empathy. These people came here and ran to Ireland. Chidi didn't even know where Ireland was. She didn't know it was a country. She came and kept running, and when she stopped, that's when she said, "Okay, I'm making a life here," and worked hard for it. And she deserved to stay. And
then is it that kind of typical thing of that kind of culture of fear? Because it's like, well, you know what? If this is past, the sky will fall in.
Absolutely.
If this, it happened with divorce, it happened with marriage equality. You know what? It'll be rack and ruin.
And they're taking our jobs, they're taking our houses, they're taking all our money. It's all they are, and it's that's not the reality of. That's the fear. And that's being pushed. But
then that kind of not necessarily the ownership of the fear, but the fear mongers themselves. And I guess this is kind of one of the concerns on Friday with the European elections, is that there's a strong chance that populists and fear mongers will hold sway. Yeah. And at one level, I think getting my head around something like marriage equality would have been.
If you look at the local elections that are taking place, the 700 plus candidates that are around the country. There's only one of those candidates that got on the front of the front of the papers on a weekend, and that was a woman that wasn't, didn't have an Irish look, and that didn't happen by accident.
So we're talking about this Elika Sunday.
And there's things like that happen. There's lots of other radical stories, but she was the one that was, kind of put on the front of the paper, and kind of.
And is that one of the I guess it's getting your message out there, and obviously it's the sensationalizing of it, and media loves that. So you know what, you might have, you know, anything that kind of seems like rational and considered and maybe not explosive, and suddenly you'll have a Peter Casey go on the radio at the weekend and he'll claim the headlines because the media itself, and it's, you know, and also it's is it a kind of a web of self-deception where it's like, well, this is the most outrageous thing, and this will carry.
It is, but it only exists in a certain threshold. It's that deep. You know, as I said, it was the kids in school. Like, they could have believed all the hype and all the sensationalism, but they knew the truth, and it was them that stood, and, you know, kind of anyone that came with the opposing argument that was for that family to stay, it was the kids' belief in what was right that, you know, kind of pushed that over the line. And, you know, they could have believed that kind of, you know, kind of small sense of sensationalism. But I think that exists and will always exist. But I think there's certain core beliefs that you have that, you know, kind of push things differently.
Is there a slight danger for some people of the kind of the public shaming of being a non-activist? So, for example, I'm sure within all of your fields of friends, like there is that kind of, you know, you've got like-minded friends obviously who'll agree, but some people don't naturally feel they're activists. They might have an opinion, but they don't express it loudly. They might go to the, you know, go and vote, but they don't feel they need to declare it. And I think, you know, and even personally, I think I remember when I with regards to the repeal of the 8 referendum last year, I went out actively. But I always felt a little bit reluctant to want to proclaim, because I felt, look, it's just going to be me pushing it out to my mates, telling them, you know what, I'm great, I went out here, I joined these people. And so squaring that idea of being an activist but also being, you know, a silent activist, or not necessarily having to feel that you need to announce to everybody that you're out there, that you're doing it. How important?
Yeah, there are different types of activism. Like, if you're on a bus and you see someone from a minority and they're being abused by like 4 big huge Polish motherfuckers, you're not going to walk over and get yourself a dig in the face, but you can walk over to that person afterwards and give them a hug and ask them if they're okay, and that in itself is a form of activism.
Yep.
You know, it doesn't always have to be the militant in your face. You know, the non-violent ways are usually the best ways, they're the most lasting. You're not generating another group of enemies by insulting them or being militant towards them. You know, compromise is usually the best solution, you know. And as Joe said, there's universal truths, and when you're a kid, you know what's right and wrong, and when you're an adult, you know what's right and wrong. And fear is the thing that, as an adult, you gain more than anything else. It's like, will I lose my job if I say this and not be able to pay my mortgage? Will I be ostracised by my community if I stand up for this person who they say is like an outsider? You know, but if you believe deep down inside, you can affect change around the people who are around you first. And that's the most important thing, to affect the circle of people that you're really in touch with. And then you've got a ripple-on effect because they're in a small touch with another group of small people. And I think like that grassroots type of thing is the strongest form of activism, you know.
And then you contrasted that earlier on with I guess what you might call as an element of smartphone activism, which is somebody going, I like it, you know, and they feel like that is almost like a radical statement in itself, but it's a dangerous deception,
it's
right?
Very, very two-sided coin, that, you know. It's like what we were saying about the speed of things, the speed of the next issue is also like, how long does a hashtag have, you know, like you can hashtag things till the cows come home, but if you're not willing to stand up for that issue when it boils down to it, it doesn't really mean anything. You know, with the repeal issue, you can be guaranteed there were young fellas buying repeal t-shirts so they could go out and pull chicks on a Friday night. Like, you can be guaranteed that was happening, you know. So like, just because you're wearing a t-shirt or wearing a pin for something, it does not mean that you stand behind that thing, you know.
In the same vein, though, I think there's a lot of people who are afraid of they're afraid of being called out for being a hypocrite. Like, those people are probably hypocrites. But at the same point, I think everyday activism is incredibly important, and people just doing something means a huge amount. But a lot of people are afraid that someone's going to go, okay, you're doing this now, but you know, if in the world of like sustainability, people might say, but we all saw your holiday photos, so we know you get on a plane, and you know that there's that like kind of thing. It's like you'd rather do nothing than be called a hypocrite.
But we all
Whereas,
start walking by crawling, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? So
We're all
that,
hypocrites anyway. Like.
exactly, that's the thing. So it's better to do light a single candle.
Like the
I think that's
vegan
the
fella who's
thing.
going down and buying the avocados is like in the back pocket of a cartel in Mexico. So like you
Exactly.
choose what
You
you
choose
choose
your
to be
cause.
moral about. You know.
Yeah,
There's only so far you can go down any moralistic road before it starts becoming problematic.
exactly.
And the other thing is, like, talking about, you know, the fact that we're here talking about being artists and activists at the same time, there's a tension between that. I'm sure you guys feel it as well, like the tension between having something to say, but then also wanting to make art that maybe doesn't have something to say. And I also really strongly believe in the necessity of artists having the space to make art that has absolutely nothing political to say. You know, I think in the last few years there's been some really amazing work that's come out of Ireland that has a really strong social heart to it. And I think that's incredible, and I think artists have been a huge, massive part of the conversation around the big social changes that are happening in Ireland. But at the same time, some artists just want to make art that they feel passionate about, that doesn't have to have that message. And I think that's really, to maintain that space is really important as well.
Art has definitely been abused by the powers that be over the years, like propaganda, stuff like that, you know, for sure, definitely. And if you just want to get something out of it, you should definitely be allowed to get that desire or whatever it is, for sure.
Yeah. And so there is that. So I guess one of those things as well is the exhaustion or the exhausting nature of activism, and you kind of pointed to that in that, like, there is this kind of like where you just go, you know what, I don't want to talk about this. And I'm sure you maybe all encountered that moment where you're with friends going, you know what, I just want to talk about, you know, small nice things that happen in my life on a daily basis. Let's just leave the big conversation tonight. Does that happen to all of you
Sometimes
individually?
your friends just tell you to shut up and stop talking about Palestine.
Yeah.
Whereas I noticed for about 3 years, more or less every single gift I got from my family and friends had something like with feminist written on it. And I was a bit like, thanks, I have other interests in my life as well. But I suddenly became, you know, I became that person, and it's quite hard for people to see anything else about you. Yeah. So don't buy me a present with feminist on.
Put it on there now.
Well, by the way. Okay, well, maybe open it up to the floor. Any questions? Here we go, right? I don't know if there's a microphone. We do have a microphone. Okay.
on the way.
It's on the way. No problem. Here we go.
Fantastic debate. I'm really happy to be here. I'm Miren. I'm from a group called the Trade Justice Group in Colaf. So the points you made about the whole Rana Plaza is really good. My question to you is to do with boycotting. Like, for example, nowadays you say, oh, I'm going to boycott Coca-Cola because, you know, they do this thing in Colombia and this from Palestine. And I can tell you something. My friend Karen is from Brazil, and I lived in Brazil, and there was a fantastic campaign with Coca-Cola did, because in Brazil there used to be an expression, you can say about the Coca-Cola, where people say, for people admitting they were gay, it was a kind of way to say, I am Fanta, no Coca-Cola. And that campaign that they did in Brazil actually was really good because there was a lot of stigma about it. So my question to you is that, let's say, for example, you don't want to get Coca-Cola funding, but then what happens if after that and someone comes around? And it's the same with corporations. Nowadays, you know, the Pride, you know, the march. Last year it was full of corporations, but at the same time as well they get funding. So my question to you is that, will you be considering any corporate funding, or will you be considering, no, I wouldn't get any money from this because, you know, they are completely against my beliefs? Yeah. And will you be boycotting a particular brand because, you know, I can't work with these people anymore?
I think one thing just to start on that was that I passed through the Pride Parade last year, and I was I'd normally went to it almost every year before, and I was just taken aback how commercialised it was, how the floats were so disappointing, how it was, here's tech company A that are right on with equality. Now, things have changed, and this is all a positive thing, but also how the kind of, you know, it's a film company flogging their film release, and it's, you know, people dancing on the top of a bus to Madonna. Nothing wrong with that, but the spectacle and the edge and the excitement had gone out of it, and I thought, well, what if all of these companies were asked to put their money in to support creative forces, to create a spectacle, to create, you know, wonderful floats, to support community groups and have those first and foremost at the front of it, because they're the people that need recognition and support. And okay, it's wonderful that we've got a great tech community that's right on with equality, but maybe have them at the back. You know, so it's a kind of a reverse engineering of what it should be. There's no reason not to recognise these wonderful strides that have been made, but really the message always needs to be at the front. And the danger of that, I feel, is that the message at the front is the branded message now, or those that have paid for access. That's my little rant. But boycotting, I don't know, it's not, you know.
Well, I don't know, sort of picking up a little bit on what you guys were saying earlier about the fact that you have sort of worked with different brands. I think there's power in being an artist, and like they want you for the work that you do. So you do have power, like you were saying, Joe, of being able to put stipulations in place that make that money maybe go in a different way than it normally would. So I suppose it's up to us, if we are thinking of taking any of that kind of money, is to be smart about it and to realise that we have power within that relationship. And yeah,
you can subvert that money, like you can like turn it against the people who are funding it. You know, it doesn't have to necessarily represent what they wanted to represent. You know, they're not that clever quite often. You know, they often don't see the cryptic messages.
Yeah. Have you ever had an example of a brand that's just kind of like sleepwalked their way into not even really having an idea of what you're doing and coming up with this like, hey guys, can we do this, M&M by subset or whatever, M&Ms? Yeah.
They often come and saying like, well, we've come to you and we want you to do X, Y, and Z. But then all the briefs come and then the amendments come and then you get halfway through and it's like, okay, we're not working with you. It's just like you get to a certain point where it's like, we're not going to do that.
Yep.
You know, no amount of money can make us cross that line.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the way kind of we go. So we quite often lose a lot of things like that, but you can't just go against certain things you believe in just for a few quid, you know.
Yeah. Rather
struggle or rather postpone future projects.
Yeah.
You know, or divert funds somewhere else.
Joe, something like boycotting, and we'll say a very recent example was the Eurovision last weekend in Israel, and now we're not quite sure, I think the figures came in from RT that it was down by like maybe 70% year on year. Now we're not quite sure what the tally is between Ireland not qualifying for the final or the actual, the sense of boycotting. Like, where do you stand when it comes into a cultural sphere like that?
I've never heard of the Eurovision.
Right, okay.
No, never heard of it. No, I did meet Johnny Logan before.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, he gave a really weird handshake. He met me, and he put up his hand and he tapped me belly. And
Wow.
Yeah. So I went straight and got a pregnancy test.
All right. It's kind of like it's like grope me now.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, geez.
Anyway, question.
I'm really curious about this, the question of creativity and this new age of activism and so on. And I was wondering about if any of you could talk a little bit more about some of the constraints that maybe the activist ethos sometimes might impose upon creativity. As for example, we live in an era where everything is politicized. Even if you think you're creating something not political, somebody might read it through that political lens and have a reading of it that suggests, oh, well, why did you leave X out or whatever? And otherwise, this sort of call out, cancel culture, you said the wrong thing, so on. And I just wonder if any of you have any observations about that kind of ethos or that hyper-political consciousness that sometimes reads every cultural production in terms of its political impact or implications.
They're usually the divide and conquer types that are reading into that, so really just don't pay any opinion to them. If you're making something that you believe in and you're doing it from a pure perspective, doesn't matter what those guys say, you're bulletproof to it as long as you stick to what you truly believe in.
Like maybe even with regards, we'll say the idea of equality, gender equality or minority equality, but also that fine tipping line of the quota and the kind of idea of like, it's got to be balanced, even if it's not. There's an inherent danger as well there, and that's always being discussed of going, we want balance, but we don't want imbalance in terms of quality, in terms of the best for the position or the best for the role gets overlooked because. Yeah. So how do you have you guys had
exactly what you're saying is like you find out what your message is and you stick to it with integrity. And whatever people argue at you stick to your line. So, the quota question or the question around, you know, what is actually equality? Is it actually 50-50? Yes, it is actually 50-50. I have had that conversation. Could it be like 30? That's not equality. But I suppose the question of quotas, well, or I don't even really know. There's so much fear, I think, that comes from when you're pushing your own, like when you're pushing the message that you want to deliver. There's so much fear of change, and the reaction is always fear of change, I think. So you just have to be really steadfast in a kind of a consistent push, because otherwise your message will be sidelined really quickly, because people want to sideline your message instantly. So it's about being really steadfast and really having huge integrity in your own beliefs and sticking by them. I don't know if that really answers your question, but there you go.
I think it does.
Okay.
Does it? Yep. Maybe one or two more. Yep. Oh, just here we go. Over this side. And then Will.
Oh yeah, get Will.
All right, first who's got it? Go. Right. Oh, find it. Okay.
Hi all, brilliant debate, thank you so much. So my question is for Joe. I heard you speak before about being a school teacher and having some backlash with the George's Piece Arcade, or the Georgia Street piece, and that you had a gay agenda type pushing.
I'm still looking for that, so if anyone
Yeah. So
has it
I wondered
found.
throughout your career, is it a lot of bravery to push the messages that you want to? Like, do you need to? Does it ever impact you wanting to push a message because of your professional career?
No, I think that my greatest hurdle is self-censorship. I wouldn't pass or give too much time to what others think necessarily, because if I do, I'll be making out maybe old grey daisies or something. And nothing wrong with grey daisies. No, I think school was that was tough. You know, you put up a piece and you're open to every sort of a backlash. So, you know, kind of emails came through and phone calls came through, and contact was made with home, and you know, that was quite a really hurtful time. And when you put yourself out there, you just want a conversation that you think is equal, but sometimes the backlash can be, you know, can be sore. There was undercurrent of talking, you know, within the educational space that, you know, that you're pushing an ethos or a thought process, but you have to hold that in mind and, you know, kind of give yourself the context that 80% of all education establishments are run by the church, and where are they in the conversation? Like, maybe they were never really in the conversation, so why should they have any kind of merit? So sometimes you do kind of get a bit down, but then you just kind of refocus on what you're doing and the empathy and the correctness in what you're saying. And am I even answering the right question? Sorry.
Will?
It's a quick question to the panel. Milkshakes, art, activism, or other. The throwing of milkshakes at politicians.
Oh, the Nigel Farage yesterday we got.
Yeah. Milkshakes are a good thing. Milkshakes and eggs, they're pretty okay. You know, you can't really hurt someone with a milkshake. Just hold on to the cup.
Yeah.
So, I guess like in that regards, Nigel Farage got doused with a milkshake yesterday, and so there's an argument here, and that's quite a funny, it's creative, got all the attention. At the same time, that puts Farage front and center on all the newspapers, on all the social media spillovers, all the issues suddenly down for so suddenly the talking point is this kind of slightly, so there's an inherent danger, isn't it?
It's definitely a great distraction, yeah, and it can definitely garner sympathy for those people, you know, for sure. But it's still good to throw a milkshake over something like that.
There's only a certain depth to that again. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like throwing a milkshake on it, you know, on him, it brings a bit of controversy. But we all know he's an arsehole then at the end of it. You know what I mean? It's kind of.
But it puts him on the cover of the newspapers. It gets him, bumps up whatever. It becomes a talking point for a day, and suddenly it's like, and those that are kind of Farage fans will empathise with him and go like, oh, look, you know what? He's kind of, you know, it's like a custard pie in the face. You know, the person that goes on TV and gets it. It's like, oh, he's kind of like, this is a good thing.
But then you have the opposition to that. Like when that milkshake was thrown, I saw there was a great kind of outburst that was on social media then against that, and talked about acid being thrown in cities, and that became something of value. So, you know, the conversation might be around him, but then, you know, he might take over. But then there is that counter that comes in and creates a different kind of a conversation.
Yeah, and the national media has like many Nigel Farage stories to keep you distracted and disoccupied, like while they're doing whatever they're doing, the machinations behind. They don't be talking about what the politicians are up to, what bankers are doing behind the scenes. They're not talking about vulture funds coming in and taking all your capital and bringing it off to another country and giving you no taxes. They would rather show Leo with a fucking selfie somewhere or some shit, you know. This is the media we're dealing with today, so it's a Nigel Farage every day.
Maybe one more. Here we go. Oh, yep.
I just wanted to go back to the question there around funding and survival of artists. I think it's something that came up a bit during the talk. And I suppose maybe the artists on the panel here, your own art practice, in some ways you can make a living out of it, but other art practices, activist art practices, may not be able to, you know, make a living out of their art. And in fact, for a lot of activist artists, it actually costs them money to, you know, carry out their practice. So I suppose it's the lack of kind of proper funding for artists in Ireland, like, is preventing, you know, artists' ability to challenge society, you know. And I suppose thinking about that, I think as artists we're really good about looking at other people's situations and helping them, you know, whether it's, you know, labour in other countries. We actually don't do that a lot for ourselves and looking at our own kind of precarious situation in Ireland. And if you think about it, like, we're the artists, we're the most creative people in Ireland. We have huge power, and at a grassroots level we don't do that. And in a way, maybe it's a kind of thing of, you know, maybe not wanting to do something for ourselves, but it's kind of, if we don't do it as artists, we're preventing, you know, challenging society, you know, in a big way. And I think we should really be doing that. We should have kind of a grassroots, you know, across the arts. And you know, like was mentioned, you know, the government are well able to flog, you know, Ireland's culture, you know, for their own means. Like, we should be, you know, really going after them and looking for proper funding for the arts in Ireland.
Okay.
I believe often people get hung up on money and where the money is and where the money isn't, where artists are meant to be the most creative people, so be creative. You know, it doesn't take much to go down to the local dump and sell scraps and make some art from that, or to go around to some local businesses and get them to throw you a few quid for some pens and paper, whatever it is, like. But you don't have to seek the money from the powers that be all the time and think that if you don't get that money, well, then you can't make art. You can make art about almost anything. It's just be creative with it. Be creative with where you're seeking money. Be creative where you're seeking your tools, and be creative where you're seeking your alloys. And I think that will help people move forward a lot more than just worrying about, oh, I haven't got this cash, I haven't got that cash. Because that's just a pitfall you can't do fuck all about anyway, so it's a waste of time.
What? Sorry. What do you guys? One question from. But let's go for this question. Sorry. Here we go.
It's great to be here. Really good conversation, guys. I just wanted to ask, do you think that it is a privilege to be able to make art for art's sake?
No, I think it's a desire, it's a need, it's a must do. It's not a privilege at all, because you don't need anything to make art. You just make it, it's within you, and you've got to get it out of you. You've got to create that thing, and sometimes it makes a social comment, and sometimes it's just a weird shape that no one's ever seen before.
I think in terms of theatre, yes, it is. I mean, theatre and the performing arts, above a certain basic level of making work, like, you do need money, and you do need some way of making what you're making, and you need a way of paying your rent and all that sort of stuff. So we see in theatre, it's generally very white, very middle class, up until recently very male, well, still a little bit. And I'm afraid that when living expenses in Ireland keep rising, that only exacerbates the problem. And it means that the people who have a little bit of backup and financial support are the ones who then can kind of get further. And not just in theatre, obviously. So for me, and at the core of Waking the Feminists, our argument was always about the stories and about the fact that if we're only getting stories from half of the population, it's a very twisted and very blunt view of the world. And if we have stories from more people, it's a more interesting form of art. So to have it as a more diverse, to have more opportunity for different people to make art, I think is so important, because then we end up having art that appeals to different people, because otherwise we always end up having the same kind of stories repeated over and over again.
Yeah, and I think film is very similar to that. Like, you have to get to a very certain stage before people give you funding, and funding is a huge amount, and then you become somewhat dictated to by the funding, and a lot of people come and weigh in, and that does happen with costumes as well. And when you get to a certain point, if it's going to impact, if they want to sell something through the costumes, then you do get a lot of opinions coming in, and it can be a committee of opinions coming in and saying this, that and the other. And so yeah, it is a privilege to kind of be in a situation where you could just produce something for itself. And I mean, with the costume directory, the funny thing is, it is done in my spare time, but like, it's flattering every now and again. Someone will send me a CV, and I'm a bit like, well, yeah, if you want to come and sit in my sitting room on a Sunday and have a cup of tea, grand, but I've no money to pay you. And I think that's the thing, is you can sometimes offer things up to people, and you can tell people about a project who have money, and they're like, brilliant, great, come to me when it's done. And it's a retrospective thing that they'll get on board with when they see the finished result, rather than investing in an idea in the beginning.
But then these projects are never done, really. Isn't that the point of activism? Is that there's a rollover effect. So there's no such thing as like, right, okay, that one's done and dusted, tick the box, put it away.
Yeah.
Like, these things are constantly evolving, and one issue evolves into the next, and it's all just about, you know, a sense of progressiveness and a sense of equality and open-mindedness, right?
Yeah, that's where your empathy messes with you sometimes, because there is always another issue, there is always another marginalised group of society, there is always another wrong, definitely.
Yeah. And then I guess finally, on a final note, just in terms of the future of activism, I guess one of the things is there's again, this kind of maybe slightly contradicts what I just said, but the idea of there's a lot of campaigns out there, you know, whether it's within the fashion industry, within gender equality, within minority representation, within direct provision, within fashion. So it's like these are, to an extent, also competing in terms of our attention, and competing in terms of who gets prioritized. And is there anything you've noted in particular from your own experiences that you think is a kind of a steer towards what activism in the next 10, 15 years might look like?
I don't know. I think these things come in waves, and I don't know if you guys feel the same, but I feel like there was the wave of feminism in the last 5 years, and I feel like certainly in the media that's tapering away now. And something else is going to take its place. So I feel like there's times where you can throw all your energy into one area, and then you can kind of let it sort of recede from you a little bit and look into another area. So this idea that things are always competing, of course things are always competing, but we can always, you can always find new energy for a new project or a new idea. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
Like, the next issue is definitely going to be legalising marijuana, let's be honest.
Okay.
That has to be the next one, yeah.
Okay, get on board, everyone. Hashtag legalise marijuana. Lian, Sinead, Subset, Joe, and thank you guys as well.
Good activist if I didn't say it. Even though the system isn't perfect, it's the system we have, so please go and vote on Friday.
Yeah.
We gonna help y'all see clear. It's real hip hop music from the soul, y'all. Yeah, check it.